Homo erectus spreading out into different parts of the world across Eurasia and in Africa at about 1.2 million years ago. In this section, we're going to look at what we now call Middle Pleistocene Homo. In the old days, we called these creatures Archaic Homo Sapiens, which is like calling somebody an old and disappointing version of what was yet to come. And there's a few reasons we might want to abandon that terminology. For one, I would say a lot of the terminology that we still use in human evolution is associated with this idea that creatures are on an ever upward trek until they finally got to the pinnacle, which is us. And it is true that these creatures are somewhere between Homo erectus and what we classify as Homo sapiens. And it is true that they lived around between 800,000 to 300,000 years ago when we see the first emergence of the creatures we classify as Homo sapiens. But what we should avoid is this idea that any of these creatures was necessarily leading up to something else. There were a variety of Middle Pleistocene Homo creatures doing their own things, adapting to their own environment, making their own tools, and in some cases doing just fine. And so we have this idea sometimes, again, that people are waiting to turn into something else when they can be more perfect because we're the perfectest. But actually, evolution doesn't work that way. It branches off. Creatures do their own thing for a while. Maybe they come back in and survive. Maybe they don't, but you can have a pretty good run for 500,000 years or so. It's more than Homo sapiens have. So we'll see. We'll see if we were as successful as the Middle Pleistocene Homo. Again, a lot of these terms are leftovers from the old days when these fossils were first discovered. So in the last class, we talked about Homo habilis, man the tool maker. Again, we now know that they were not the only ones that were making tools, or that Homo sapiens are exclusively defined by making tools. In the same way, the term Homo erectus technically refers to upright human. And they were so named because at the time when they were discovered, they were thought to be the first bipedal creatures. Well, we now know that goes back millions of years before then. But the name here has stuck as well. Some people refer to this period as the muddle in the middle because things are happening, but there's still a lot yet to be determined. A lot of these creatures are obviously not on the main lines of what would lead to be Homo sapiens, but what exactly they were doing and how they might have contributed is still a little bit muddly, a little bit messy. So we do see some more cool Middle Pleistocene tools. What do you think they were doing with these tools? What were they able to do? Yeah. Oh, very cool. If you can find tools like this, then you have something. So during this period, we definitely see, and there's some debate about whether there was a scavenging period at all in Homo development, but we definitely see much more deliberate hunting. We have these new techniques that people start to use, sometimes called pressure flaking. So it's not just banging stones together. And you can make smaller points and more refined points that you can turn into projectiles. And you can do more scraping and things like knives so that you can do hunting and butchering and get more meat and probably still breaking up those bones and sucking out the marrow, but you can do more of this more sophisticated hunting and butchering. Now, I want to just say here that when we talk about we get very excited about hunting. And again, this is somewhat an artifact of the people who like to study this period in time. But this is also a point in time in which people develop different tools and techniques for gathering. And so all during this time, there are no crops, There's no agriculture. There's no domesticated animals. People are living, Middle Pleistocene Homo are living by hunting and gathering. And part of that is developing more sophisticated hunting techniques. And those kinds of tools, and those show up very well in the archaeological record, especially if you can see animals being butchered. It's very cool. But people are also developing new ways to think about and exploit the vegetation and different tubers and plants in their environment. And this will be important as we talk about eventually the domestication of plants and animals, which is the end of the Pleistocene at about 12,000 years ago as we move past the Stone Age, you might say. But I just want to highlight it here. It's not just hunting that develops. People are also developing gathering. And in most hunter and gatherer groups today, most of the calories come from the gathering rather than the hunting, even if it's an important inclusion into the diet. Very cool thing happens here. Jaw, what happened? You had a comment that was so fire. There's been quite a bit of debate about when exactly in the Homo lineages people started to control fire. It's actually difficult to tell, archaeologically speaking, when you have controlled fire rather than maybe a lightning strike or something like that. You might say uncontrolled fire, or people using uncontrolled fires to their advantage. Some people say that controlled fire in cooking goes back 2 million years ago, but it seems like at least the best evidence that we have for it is from this period, from the Middle Pleistocene Homo. And as Jaw tells us, it's useful for a number of things. Well, before we get to cooking, let's just start with light and heat. And if you're moving into different climates, being able to control fire, being able to produce light, and being able to produce heat might be important if you're dealing with winters and stuff like that. But it's also a way of getting more calories in your diet from the cooking and from being able, especially your infants being able to deal with the food that is being brought home. Now, we talked about the expansion of the brains, and to us, that seems like an obvious advantage. But brains are also very energy intensive. They require a lot of food. And if you have a developing infant who is unable to contribute, but has this very developing brain, how do you get the calories necessary to sustain that infant until the time that they'll be able to actually contribute to the group? And fire and being able to cook food and feed it to youngsters is probably hugely important in that process of being able to support large brains. There's some disadvantages to being large brain too, because it makes you very dependent on your parents and on your group, and it requires a lot of energy, especially during the early stages. But controlled fire is one of the ways that it seems like we get to that point. During this period, there are a lot of different groups that emerge in terms of how the Middle Pleistocene Homo was organized. So we see that as these Homo erectus populations spread out and develop in different areas, we see some continental differences in the ways that they would develop their bodies and brains in Europe and in Asia and in Africa. And there's a range of variation here, and we're probably dealing with different species or significant variability within a species. In the European area, we see a wide range of cranial forms, our text tells us. So some pretty small-brained creatures up to some pretty large-brained creatures. Pretty wide ranging there. I showed you some of the finds in Asia of Homo erectus, and this is the area where you seem to see the most persistence of some of the Homo erectus features, but then you see some features that we associate more with Middle Pleistocene Homo. And then crucially in Africa, where you see another type of Middle Pleistocene Homo emerge about 800,000 years ago, which is a large-brained, a consistently large-brained variety of Homo that starts to evolve toward the modern humans in Africa by around 200, I would say, let's say 200 to 300,000 years ago. So I want to be very careful here because, in fact, a lot of people in the old days looked at that original Homo erectus expansion and the kinds of things that were going on during the Middle Pleistocene Homo period, the Archaic Homo Sapiens in Europe and in Asia, and said, aha, that's where we get our biological difference from. That appears not to be the case. That is to say, what we see here is, yes, biological differences in the Homo erectus populations that become the Middle Pleistocene Homo in these other areas. But in terms of where we get Homo sapiens, we see some of the large-brained Homo varieties appearing first in Africa, and then we see Homo sapiens emerge first in Africa at around 200,000 years ago. In the old days, we used to think that some of these Homo erectus or middle Homo populations were the ways in which Homo sapiens evolved, but the genetic evidence, as well as increasingly the fossil evidence, points to a homeland in Africa for the development of Homo sapiens. And so this is called the assimilation model, in which what we now think happened is that modern humans originate in Africa, Homo sapiens, spread out again, replacing then the Middle Pleistocene Homo species that were in those areas before. Now, there's some interesting stuff we'll talk a little bit more, we'll talk quite a bit more about in the next class that happens, but I just want to preview it here. It's a lot more complicated than we first thought. And including even the new assimilation model, we now believe that was at least some interbreeding with some of these Middle Pleistocene Homo populations. And so there's some interbreeding with Neanderthals, some interbreeding with a population that was at least genetically found called Denisovans. So we see that the Homo species originate in Africa. They spread out from there. They basically replace these other Middle Pleistocene Homo populations, but there is interbreeding throughout these lineages and throughout these areas. So, very important quote. We'll start with this in the next class, but I wanted to preview it here because it's important for us to understand. So we now believe, or the evidence leads us to the conclusion that all the humans we have today, all of us, are the descendants of around 30,000 early Homo sapiens that emerge in sub-Saharan Africa around 200 to 250,000 years ago. And then from Africa, they populate the globe in stages. I just wanted to show you how this happens in this map, where you have the emergence of Homo sapiens here around 200 to 300,000 years ago, spreading out into South Africa, West Africa, and then crossing over into what is now Saudi Arabia at about 75,000 years ago. Going across the southern route, one of the first migrations was to get people all the way into Australia, which is by itself an incredible achievement here. And then spreading into other parts of the world, about 45,000 years ago, Europe, later on into the Americas, later on into places like New Zealand, Hawaii. And so we have eventually the spreading out of Homo sapiens into all parts of the world, except we don't get down into Antarctica. So yeah, all the habitable world, but not that far. But now we haven't been able to figure that one out yet. But we have the human population spreading out all over the world. But again, I just wanted to emphasize here, if you remember We began this unit with looking at human variation today. A lot of people want to believe that that is a very old thing, a very evolutionarily deep thing. It is not an evolutionary deep thing. It is a product of our much more recent migration. Again, all of us are the product of a Homo sapien migration inside and outside of Africa. And some of the skin is color and differences like that we see emerge in the last 20, 30, 40,000 years.